Alright guys, so it seems like there's been a bunch of issues on the Terminator X Facebook forum with people having startup issues. So I wanted to make kind of like a quick check through list to go over if you're doing first startup and it has a failed first startup or runs poorly on the first startup. This is just going to be like a basic thing. Check this, you know, it'll do this if this is bad. Just some of the things I've helped probably close to 15 to 20 guys get their stuff started. A lot of people want to lean towards the hardware is bad. It's, you know, 95% of the time it's either an install error or something set up incorrectly. So we're going to go through and show you guys step by step from what is most common to what is least common. So let's get into the video. Alright guys, so the first thing to do on Terminator X with a no start issue is to verify that you have continuous RPM update on your handheld. So if you crank it and it goes 200, you know, 190, 200, 190, 200, 190, and it doesn't ever read error or stall while you're cranking, then you've got good RPM pickup. Don't mess around with changing the sensor out to anything other than an OEM sensor because it just won't work. So that's one of the first things I check to verify that the ECU at least has a good crank RPM signal. Alright guys, so another thing that's super imperative on a standalone setup is having good battery voltage, consistent battery voltage. So say you have 12 volts, you crank it, it goes down to 9 volts, you need to either get a different battery or get a larger battery. The ECU will not fire injectors and your coils at 9 volts. I would say the cutoff limit is like 10.5 volts, but it's good to just have a good charged battery that will crank the engine 200 RPM and fire right up. So I know a lot of people are trying to shave weight and put a small battery in. It's something that's super imperative, at least for the first start, is to make sure that you have adequate cranking voltage. So look for above 10.5 while cranking, you should be good. One thing that I think that Holley should have done, because these harnesses are the same, these main harnesses are the same for Dominator and HP. I think when they boxed these, they should have went ahead and tagged it on this map sensor and put like a big pink or red label on here that said, "Do not use for NA." So 90% of the issues that I've seen with no start or poor running is because on an NA setup, the wizard will ask you what your cam size is, what your engine size is, your idle RPM, forgive me, there's a couple more, but I can't really remember right now. Injector size. What they don't ask you is if you're using your map sensor here. So what a lot of people do is see this map, throw it on whatever intake that they have, shove it in the map sensor, and they think it's good. On an NA setup, it defaults to use the ECU mounted map sensor. So one quick way to test that is if you have your excuse me, if you have your handheld, go ahead and key the car on, and it'll have 98, 99, like close to 100 map reading. Just key on, no cranking. And that depends on your altitude, how much map you'll read with just key on, but it should be like 96 or up to like 102. So if you don't have this hooked up and you're on an NA setup, you go to crank it, the map sensor will never move because effectively this is just reading atmospheric pressure. So what that tells the computer is it's either A, got a very massive vacuum leak, which it doesn't really know what to do with because it sees the TPS is at 0, or it looks at it and it'll make it super rich because there's a high demand of air right now, or high demand for fuel because there's a ton of air. So that's one of the downfalls for speed density, which is what this is based off of. But what I tell everybody is, if you're NA setup, or if you're not NA setup, hook this up. If you have the cable or have a computer with the software, you can change it later, which is easy to do. If you just want to run a 1-bar map sensor on your intake, you can just go ahead and go into the laptop software and select which one you have. And obviously you just uncheck your ECU mounted map, and then you go with whatever one fits your description. So this here is the manifold air temp sensor. Another critical part of the speed density setup. It needs to know the density of the air. Basically is what they're saying is the temp. So obviously the cooler air is more dense. So you need to have this plugged in, and most people run it in their intake. So in their intake pipe like that. I've got my booger welded in here, and you shove that in there, and then it reads whatever your intake air temp is. You can get one of these sensors and just hang it there until you get it, hang it next to where the engine is taking in air, and then that'll give you a good enough. But you need to mount this in your intake piping eventually. So that's a required sensor. I've seen people start up and run without it. I don't know how they do. I assume it defaults to like a really high or really low temp, but I would just go ahead and get one. What I like to do on these is make sure that it's as close to the manifold or header collector as possible, and you need to verify that you have a really good seal on both the head flange and on your V-band or whatever style collector gasket that you have. If this sucks, if this is past the collector and it's sucking fresh air in, then it's going to read lean. I think lean. So you want to verify that you have no header leaks. If you're on a turbo setup, especially with a large exhaust coming off the turbo, so you're 4 or 5 inch, you want to really make sure that you have enough length there. I would favor towards the 20 inches on a 5 inch setup past the turbo. I also personally don't recirculate my wastegate before this. Some people do, some people don't. But on an NA setup, a lot of people buy these cheap headers and they're 2 inch or 1 7/8 primary, and they dump out to a 3 inch collector, and then they're running a 4.8 or a 5.3 on 3 inch collectors with just like a little elbow on the end of it, and then they put this somewhere in the collector. It doesn't have enough back pressure. A 5.3 or 4.8 isn't going to produce enough exhaust gases to really get an accurate reading consuming the sensor. Next thing is to verify that you're getting spark. So a lot of people will just pull the plugs out and test it against the head, rolling over to see if it's got spark. We use these a lot for work, so it's an inductive spark checker. Basically, you just set it up next to the plug wire and it'll flash. These don't usually work on a non-resistor plug, but for 95% of the things you see in 2020 now is a resistor style plug anyway. So these are like $5. You can get them at most auto parts places. And like I said, you just put it next to, touch the wire, and it'll show a flash in here. I'll tell you real quick, if you've got spark on that cylinder, you can do it to every one of them if you want. Just a sanity check to make sure you're getting spark. So last thing I want to talk about on the harness is these two eyelets, and these are for your head. So this is your coil ground. It says connect to cylinder head only. So I've seen people connect these to the valley cover. I've seen people connect them to the block. The bad thing is when you go to the block, then the spark plug has to find ground through the head studs. So it's not always the most reliable thing to do it that way, especially if you have a composite gasket, then that could hinder that. With a multi-layer steel gasket, it'll usually ground through it, but my recommendation is to do what Holley says with these, ground them to the head. And not to one head, ground each one to each head. So I actually had to extend this wire because I don't have room on the back of that head to run it to the front of that head. So that's why this one's so long. This is a more expensive thing, but it's still only like $30. This is a Noid light set. So this is just a Harbor Freight one. If you guys want to know, the item number on it is 97959. I actually use this for a stock computer setup because I ended up having bad injectors that were stuck and it wouldn't run. And that's one of the things, like if you guys are pulling junkyard engines and it's been sitting for 10 years and you don't know that, sometimes the injectors are gummed up. You can be mad at Holley for their ECU being junk, but it's, you know, it could physically be firing the injectors, but they're so clogged up with the ethanol gas that's been sitting for 8 to 10 years that, you know, it's not their fault. So what you do with this is, and I wish I would have grabbed my harness, but basically you just unplug your injector from your injector harness. You put this in, you crank it over, and you kind of hold it over a shadow, and if it flashes, then you have injector signal. So you can do that for all of them, and if you have pulse on all of them, then the injectors theoretically should be firing as long as you have fuel pressure. So if you do that, and they do have signal to them, but you pull them all out of the intake and they don't physically fire while it's cranking over, then you know that your injectors are stuck, which is how I use these. I don't know what the condition of the engine that you guys are installing this on is, so it's a good idea to do, if you're still having issues after this point, do a compression test. So the ECU can't help an engine with no compression on several cylinders or low compression on several cylinders. It doesn't really matter why that happened, but say you put too long push rods in it and the lifter's pumped up and it's hanging the valves open. The ECU can't help that. So do a compression test, make sure your motor's healthy. I don't really want to go too much further into any detail on this subject on here anyways. If you guys do need help, I try to stay on the Holley Terminator X forum on Facebook. I also have a Facebook group. It's Dirt Floor Fab Garage Talk. It is in the link in the description of this video if you want to add it on there. If you guys need help diagnosing it and you're at your wit's end with it, go ahead, get on there, get a hold of me. I'll try to help you as much as I can or as much as I have time for. Our work is picking back up and getting kind of hectic, but I like to diagnose these things, and I want to see people enjoying their cars. I know it's frustrating when stuff doesn't run, especially after you spent a lot of money on your car. So yeah, if you guys need further help, go ahead and join the Facebook group. I want to say thank you guys for watching, thank you guys for subscribing, and I'll see you guys on the next video.